Well, the House of Commons is beginning its holiday break, and MPs are heading home at the end of a hectic year. Time to pick the winners and losers. Always exciting, but doubly so on this, the eve of election 2015. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce are here, and joining us, our colleague Jennifer Ditchburn from the Ottawa Bureau of Canadian Press. Let's get started right away. Here's the first question. Who surprised you the most on the Canadian political landscape this year? Andrew.
I'm going to say James Moore, not necessarily in a good way. There are ministers in this cabinet who managed to preserve their dignity, and there's ministers who somehow, I don't know, they get the short straw, but they wind up having to carry the can for every dumb populist idea that comes out of the PMO's office. And of late, it's certainly been James Moore who's been doing that, having to go out there and say, we're going to regulate all the prices of Canadian and U.S. policy prices into conformity with each other, which nobody thinks is a good idea. That crazy idea where we'll let Burger King take over Tim Hortons, but now we're going to design their whole business strategy for the next 5 years. It just somehow he seems to have walked into that, and it's unfortunate. People, I think, before this thought of him as a serious guy, a possible leadership contender. He's looking very diminished.
Chantal.
To pursue the negative note, I'll say Thomas Mulcair over the fall. He seemed to me to be off his game. Maybe it's because the NDP has kept trying. He's kept being told that he's the best opposition leader in decades, and it never shows in the polls or in by-election votes. But his handling of the harassment issue, I thought was foggy at best. He looked lost in some wilderness, accusing the Liberals of victimization, and losing, I think, the thread of the conversation over sexual harassment, which it was. Then out of the blue, he pops out with this notion that the NDP in power would restart the gun registry. You discover that his MPs didn't really know about it. He goes off to France and starts telling a think tank and European socialists that they should worry about the Canada-Europe free trade agreement. That's fine, except that as far as I know, the NDP is not campaigning against it in Canada. It kind of looked like he lost his groove. And I think that they are deeply troubled, the NDP Brain Trust as a whole, as to where to go from here.
This after a year where he really had his groove, especially on the Senate story, he kind of led the way on that charge. Jennifer.
Well, I wish I could say I was going to go positive, but I'm not. I'd say Alison Redford and Olivia Chow. Alison Redford, I mean, she won a majority government. She was getting a lot of accolades about this national energy strategy. And then, boom, these ethical problems. Now, sitting from afar, I guess people in Alberta might say that they saw it coming, but certainly we didn't. Olivia Chow, for someone who's lived in the political arena for her whole life and just sort of lives and breathes politics, her very dismal showing in the Toronto election was surprising.
Bruce.
Joe Oliver's my answer. I think he's obviously a very smart person. I think he's well-intentioned, but I think he's probably the weakest communicator that the government has. So I was surprised that they appointed him finance minister. It's a very important podium role for the Conservative, for any government. He wasn't a good communicator on behalf of the government in the job that he had before. The way that he characterized the difference between people who were for pipelines and against pipeline created a rift that the government is still grappling with today.
All right, well, so you all went negative. I'm going to force you to go positive here with this next one. The best political move of the year. Chantal, you start.
Okay, let me try to wiggle off your hook by saying that it's not a political move, but I thought that the federal leaders, and I start with Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who as Prime Minister gets more criticism than anything else from panels, handled themselves well in the aftermath of the Parliament Hill shooting. I think it was an opportunity to rise to a challenging moment. I think that they all did, and that Stephen Harper did well.
Jennifer.
I would say it's possibly Stephen Harper's draining of the federal surplus. So we're down to $1.4 billion left from $6.4 billion that the federal budget talked about.
Based on old projections.
Right. So he's got the family tax cut package, billions of dollars in infrastructure funding. What this means is that the opposition parties are going to have really no wiggle room to play with when they're developing their platforms, and they'll have to commit to cutting something when they're doing all their cost projections. So possibly a pretty canny move by the Prime Minister.
Okay. Bruce.
I think it was the decision, I don't know how conscious and strategic, but I assume it was, a decision by the Prime Minister to get more involved in talking about world affairs and world issues. I think that It may be that this has become an area of greater interest for him, be that as, whatever the reason is, it has allowed Canadians to see him in a different light than that politician who seems to be the most hyper-partisan, focused on daily combat with other parties here in Canada. And while people might not agree with his position on every issue, our research shows that he tends to be supported on most of the positions that he's been taking on foreign policy issues in the last 6 to 8 months.
Most traveled prime minister ever, I think, which is interesting for him because he'd hardly traveled outside the country at all before he became prime minister. Andrew.
I had the same choice as Chantal, but for different reasons. I thought the party leaders' speeches after the terrorist attacks were remarkable. Not because they put politics aside, but because they didn't. But they took their politics to a higher level. There was no doubt they were each trying to frame the issue to their advantage, or at least not get it framed to their disadvantage. And yet they did so in ways that were dignified and classy and restrained, and you really couldn't necessarily disagree with any of it. They would all agree with each other, but they put different emphasis on it. And this is at a moment where emotions are running very high. It would have been very easy for any of them to strike a false note. And you know, when in those situations, you can really do yourself a lot of damage. So this was people practicing politics at its best on a very high wire, and I thought it spoke well of all three of them.
With no script.
With no script.
Really?
Yeah, in some cases, yeah. Worst political move. Jennifer.
I'm cheating again because I'm going to name two people.
You are cheating.
Yes.
You're becoming the Rex Murphy of this panel.
Provincial politicians Tim Hudak, Ontario PC leader, and Pauline Marois. Hudak for his very dark promise to cut 100,000 public service jobs, which put him on the defensive for the entire Ontario provincial election. And Pauline Marois for thinking it was a good idea to put Pierre-Carl Pelledo out front. And who can forget the fist pump and how she had to focus on the sovereignty question. And you could see the polls just go boom after that. So there you go.
You're really thinking provincial on this tonight. That's good. Bruce.
I think the Veterans Affairs botch-ups by the Conservatives, I think that at the end of the day, some of the decisions that were made in that department will save very, very small amounts of money, create enormous political strains within the party and certainly tension among other voters as well. So bad decisions and even worse salesmanship by probably the worst political communicator in the government, Julian Fantino, a real management problem for the Prime Minister right now.
Andrew.
The Prime Minister's handling of the Supreme Court, not only just in terms of the cases brought, I mean, on the Senate decision, you know, why they didn't get a ruling before they went down those road for many years of ultimately futile reforms. The Nadon decision, I didn't agree with it, but they didn't need to sail that close to the wind for such a relatively mediocre candidate. But above and beyond all that, the reaction to it, particularly when they went after the Chief Justice, that is just so small time and so ill-advised, and I think was probably the worst moment for the Prime Minister this year. That was just really, you really started to wonder, where is the judgment here? Can we really entrust the institutions of government to this bunch?
Chantal.
I thought the way Justin Trudeau handled the debate over the combat role, Canada's combat role against Islamic State, this was an opportunity for Trudeau to start answering the question that many voters have about how much substance there is behind the charisma. It was a missed opportunity in the way that he accounted for his party's position. He put himself at odds with thoughtful people on foreign policy like Bob Rae and Lloyd Axworthy. That's never a good place for a federal leader to be, but he also didn't handle his part of and his stance very well. And I don't think it's totally a coincidence that, you know, Liberal support softened after that, because he didn't walk into the frame of the Prime Minister on that day.
All right, let's try and get a couple in here before the break, and I'll have to do that quickly. The riskiest move that paid off this year, Bruce?
Probably John Tory deciding to get into the Toronto mayoralty race. He'd had some setbacks in his political career. I think his decision to get involved was part of a lifelong commitment to try to provide some sort of public service. And there were plenty of months during that long, arduous campaign where it looked like it might fail, and he'd have another political setback, and of course he won in the end.
Andrew.
Kathleen Wynne running for re-election on a very left-wing budget. I mean, she raised taxes, she basically shrugged at the deficit, she raised spending, she introduced the biggest new social program in a generation with the Ontario Pension Plan. A lot of conventional wisdom would say, you can't do that, the people don't want to see that. And she ran and won. And I think this is relevant to federal politics, because when we talk about the Prime Minister having boxed in the other parties with these family benefits, et cetera. We're assuming that they can't run deficits, that they can't raise taxes. I don't want them to do that in policy terms, but I think there's more room for that politically, as she's shown.
All right, Chantal.
I think Andrew stole my copy. I too would pick Kathleen Wynne. She's the only provincial incumbent, I think, to win re-election this year. Fourth mandate, not obvious. And I also found it inspiring that you could actually go to voters and treat them like adults and say, well, I'm not going to promise you tax cuts. I'm actually going to campaign against tax cuts. And this is why I'm doing it. And to win a majority mandate on that basis, I think there is a very strong message there for Justin Trudeau and Thomas Mulcair.
We should say, so you got a big assist from the two other party leaders who did not run particularly good campaigns. But she pulled it off.
Yeah. Jennifer.
New Brunswick Liberal leader Brian Gallant, who promised during the provincial election to review the province's very restrictive laws around abortion. And there are very socially conservative pockets of New Brunswick. This could have been very bad for him, but he stuck to that. And, you know, I don't know that it paid off necessarily, but it was definitely a risky move, and he still won the election.
All right. Whose reputation took the biggest hit this year? Andrew.
Alison Redford. I mean, I think going in, I think people, even if you didn't necessarily share her politics, she was very highly regarded for her background, her skills, her experience. I think there's very little of that left now, not only in terms of the ethical questions, but I think we mentioned earlier, but just managerial competence, relations with caucus. She was pretty much a thoroughgoing disaster, and it's really hard to watch.
Chantal.
Parliament as a workplace. I think most Canadians would have thought that Parliament would be a model, a leading-edge place for egalitarian relationships between men and women. It is obviously not that, and not just because two Liberals were suspended over allegations of harassment, but because all the stories that came out, and what was striking was that most of the people who work around the Hill, columnists who work there, as opposed to those who work from afar, tended to think that probably there was an issue to be dealt with within Parliament, and that there was, you know, a kind of a sickness in the place over power relationships. That should be troubling to most Canadians who probably expected better from their Parliament.
Jennifer.
I'd say Liberal MPs Massimo Pichetti and Scott Andrews. If you consider the level of the hit, so these two gentlemen weren't exactly household names, and then all of a sudden they have these allegations of personal misconduct, serious personal misconduct leveled against them. We don't know, you know, what the truth behind those allegations. Of course, they haven't been tested in court. But if you look at it as a calculation, I'd say that their reputations took the greatest hit.
My answer is the same as Andrew's. Alison Redford. This is someone who had a great deal of power, plenty of opportunity to start creating a different discussion between Alberta and the rest of the country, and was well launched in that. And I think she failed, not just because of the personal indiscretions, the spending issues and that sort of thing, but I think a real test of political leadership, how you manage the relationships that you have with people in your caucus and your party. I think her problems were as much there, and an important lesson to all political leaders of the need to work on that.
Quick around the table, just the name, up-and-comer to watch next year. Chantal.
Pierre-Carl Péladeau, the heir apparent to the PQ crown, because he is going to be a story that will keep on giving. And because he could, you know, he's popular, he could give the Bloc Québécois a boost and change some calculations in the election, in the federal election in Quebec.
That was more than just a name, but that's okay. Jennifer.
Conservative MP Aaron O'Toole, who's been sort of the cleanup man on the Veterans Affairs file, former Air Force lawyer, and he's not even the parliamentary secretary on Veterans Affairs.
Yeah, he's quite a pile to deal with in front of him. Bruce.
Kathleen Wynne, for me, very interesting. Her dynamic with the Prime Minister is a really important thing to watch. But I also think that Pierre-Carl Péladeau will be maybe the most fun to watch the next year.
Andrew.
And Michael Chong, he didn't get what he wanted with the Reform Act, but I think he's established himself as a man of principle, as the voice of the disaffected Tory backbench, and I could see him running a credible leadership campaign, not necessarily to win, but to establish a voice, you know, the importance of those issues, and to make himself a player in that government.
That is the fourth year in a row that Andrew has picked Michael Chong.
I don't believe that's true.
That's not true. But
That's a good one, though.
But it is a good one. All right. We're going to take that quick break, but more still to come, including the dreaded "Who said this?" question. They don't know about that yet. We'll be back in a minute. And welcome back. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce are here, along with Jennifer Ditchburn. New category this year, "Who said this?" Here comes the quote. Clearly, I allowed the passion and the anger with Paul Calandra. Bruce Anderson.
course he
Got
will.
it.
Would get that.
Come on, that was Paul Calandra, that famous day that he's
not gonna play
apologized to the
Family
House
Feud
for his
with you.
comments, his lack of answers in question period, really. Here's the second one. This is a little harder. Whatever our views are about the future of this country, whatever course we want the country, wrong, to take you out of it now, Bruce. At a very basic level, we are nothing more than human beings who at a very fundamental level care for each other.
Every
Was
politician
it
ever.
after the shooting?
It was after the shooting is right.
was.
It was
Who
just
said it?
Thomas
Trudeau?
Mulcair.
It was not Thomas Mulcair.
Was Trudeau or Elizabeth May?
Make a guess.
Elizabeth May.
Andrew and
I was so
Jennifer.
close. I was so close.
Good guess. No, we'll give you both points for that. So the score after round two, the final round, was 3 with 1 and 1 with none, and we won't say who that was.
The usual.
Next question, and the final question for this year. What do you think the ballot question next year should be, Andrew?
Well, I don't think we should tell people what the ballot question is because it's
Oh,
up to
come
them.
on.
But if you were asking me,
Just
it's,
play the game.
is the opposition a greater risk to the economy than the Conservatives are to democracy? And I'm not terribly keen on either of them on either score, but there's lots of people I think who would like to punish the Tories for what they have done to Parliament, what the high-handed treatment of it. But I think one always wants to wonder, what do you do in the process? Do you put the economy at risk? And that's going to be their trump card.
Interesting.
I haven't found very many governments that are a real risk to the economy, but that's besides the point. I think the question on many people's minds, both pro and con, are you willing to sign up for a second Conservative decade? Because that is what it is.
Well,
Jennifer.
I'm going to travel further down the road that you started with, which is that we shouldn't tell people what the ballot question is, and actually
Wait to get slapped down for it.
I didn't say you should tell us what it's
raised his
going to
eyebrows.
be, sort of suggesting what you think it should be.
Right, but and I also think politicians shouldn't. Canadians are going to be bombarded by political marketing in a way that they've never seen before. Twitter, Facebook, radio, TV, your inbox, and people should know that they also can determine what the ballot question is. Now they have all this opportunity through social media, talk shows. Go to the debate, go to the candidates meeting, and say what you think the election should be about. I mean, I'm being a bit idealistic, but we really shouldn't say what the ballot question is.
Okay.
Right.
Well, it wasn't my idea for a question. It was actually Bruce's idea for a question.
No, I think that the ballot question is almost always the same thing, which is about who, as a leader, and which party best reflects your values. I don't think that we're going to have an election that's going to be about one stark policy choice over another. But I think we have 3 parties that are competitive. We have 3 leaders who are quite different from each other, all quite talented in their own way. And I think that Canadians would probably want to do what they generally do, which is look at their choices and say, not on this particular promise or this particular issue, but overall, over the course of a life of a government, who's likely to make the choices that best fit with my sense of the values of the country and the ones I care about.
Well skated, all of you, on that one. So thank you. Enjoy the holidays. And thanks to you, too. In the days ahead, during the holidays, look for a special ad issue with your questions. Rex will join us for that.